Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to have some rain. We need it. I'm glad that you aren't afraid of raindrops. Anyway, today we're in a series called Can You See Him? And today's topic is believing is seeing. So I'd like to start off with a question. Are there some things about God that you don't understand? Kind of a rhetorical question, I guess, isn't it? I gave some suggestions like the Trinity. How many people can understand? Who can explain to me the Trinity? Come on, Tim, you can put your hand up. What about, am I predestined or is it my free will? Yes, right? How about end times? Can you explain to me what's going to happen when Jesus comes back? Lots of people have opinions about that. Let me just ask you, can you explain everything here? Who can do that for me? Then we can look at the news, we can look at the world, and we can see all the tragedy and suffering and bad things that happen. Honestly, can you see God in that? Personally, I can't always. So, a couple of statements. You don't have to believe everything to understand something. Or to understand everything to believe something, do you? You just don't have to. None of us ever understand everything. So we have to. Maybe that's the faith thing. Believe in something. The flip side is this. There's a lot of things that are unexplainable. Right? But there's also a lot of things that are undeniable. And so we're going to look at a story from the life of Christ where we can apply this. A lot of things were unexplainable, but certainly undeniable. And I think it'll have something to speak to us. So let's jump in. It's John chapter 9. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who was been blind from birth. So what did that mean in that culture, in that society, to be blind from birth? Well, obvious things. He never saw a sunset or a beautiful flower. He'd never seen anything, right? He'd never seen the face of his parents. But it also meant that he was not educated, was not allowed in the temple. He probably didn't have many friends, and he had to beg to survive. All right? So just by the fact that he was born blind, this was his situation in life. So, disciples are with Jesus, and they ask him, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? They're looking for a reason. All right? In their culture, they believed that if you were blind, that was a curse from God. And you had done something to deserve that. They're going to ask, was it because of the sins or his parents' sins? I don't know how a baby can sin, so I guess they blamed it on the parents, right? And we say, well, that's silly, right? Well, don't we do that sometimes? Somebody has a kid that's gone wild, you say, oh, they're not very good parents. Maybe they're great parents. But we jump to conclusions, don't we? Someone has some disease, especially if it's something we can connect with cancer. Well, if they would have taken better care of themselves, et cetera, et cetera. We like to give blame for things. So in this case, it was pretty serious, right? Who's to blame for the fact that we wouldn't ask the question today, but they did that. Who would blame this guy who's been blind all his life? So what's Jesus say? Okay, I can tell you. He does. He says, it's not because of the parent's sin, and it's not because of his sin. All right, so you got that wrong. So then he tells them why. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. That's pretty cool. It'd be nice to see the power of God in me. But it's a little strange too, isn't it? See, in God's economy, I'm going to call it that, in God's wisdom, the way God sees things, there was a good purpose in this young man being blind, right? Because God was going to be able to show off his power. So, chasing that rabbit, what we often call setbacks, negative things, are actually setups for God to be glorified. And there's all kinds of illustrations. One of my favorites is Joseph. You don't know about Joseph. He's in the Old Testament. And he was born in a wealthy family. He had a bunch of older brothers. And he was one of his father's favorites. And so he's a teenager, and he's kind of bragging about some things God has shown to him. And his brothers just couldn't stand it. And so they decided to sell him into slavery. I don't know. My sister's here. Would you sell me into slavery? I don't know. I don't know if I ever asked that question. And that's what they did. So from the time he was a teenager, he was either a slave, or then his master's wife lied about him, and then he got thrown into prison. So from 17, 18 to age 30, prime years of life, right? That was his destiny. Then he was able to translate a dream for some folks. He said, just don't forget me when you get out of prison, well, one of them. But they forgot him. And a couple of years, I think, passed, and then finally, the king needed a dream interpreted, and this guy said, oh, I know a guy who can interpret dreams. And he instantly went from that to being the second most powerful person in the world. And God used him to save a lot of people, specifically his family, the Israelites. So lots of setbacks in Joseph, appeared to Joseph, but they were actually used by God. David's another one. He was kind of the run of the family and a shepherd. But as a shepherd, he learned to protect his sheep. And so when this Goliath guy comes along and challenges Israel, he had the courage and the expertise to fight him. Of course, the most dynamic or most important example of this is what? Jesus. Supposedly the Messiah being crucified on a cross and dying. Everybody's hopes were gone. Seemed like the ultimate setback. And of course, we just celebrate Easter. Tomb is empty. It was a setup for God to show his glory and to provide salvation for you and I. It reminded me of a couple of verses of Scripture, and then we'll move on. 1 Corinthians 13. Who knows what's in 1 Corinthians 13? It's the love chapter, right? Well, tucked in that chapter is a verse that talks about this. Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. Mirrors weren't so great back 2,000 years ago. So you kind of got an idea what you look like. So that's how our lives are, right? But then we'll see everything with perfect clarity. And then, in the future, in God's presence, well, everything will make sense. Everything will be clear. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. We all only know a little bit, right? But then, in the future, we'll know everything completely. Isn't that amazing? Just as God now knows me completely. God knows you inside and out. He knows the hairs on your head. It'd be a little scary to think about, but that's because God cares enough to know all about you. And then in Isaiah, referring to God, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. Oh, okay, maybe they're a little bit. No. God's thoughts are way different than our thoughts. And my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. So we just can't comprehend God, which most of us know. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God's God, and I'm not. Let me give a silly illustration. I didn't ask anybody if it helped in the first service. All right, so I have a pet ant. All right? I love my pet ant. I named him Andy the ant. All right? And so since I love Andy, I want him to learn stuff. So I decided I want Andy to learn arithmetic. Not calculus, just arithmetic. So I get my little blackboard and I put 2 plus 2 is 4 and show it to Andy. And I think I've got some teaching ability. So I'm a pretty good teacher. And nothing. So I'm going to use a little creativity. Ants like sweets. I'll get 4 pieces of candy, right? 2 pieces of candy plus 2 pieces of candy equals 4 pieces of candy. You get that, Andy? Still, nothing from Andy. Why? Because Andy can't comprehend even simple math, right? So let me ask you a question. Are we closer to the ant or are we closer to God when it comes to understanding? I personally think we're probably closer to the ant. All right? So, our God's too big to understand, right? To understand a lot. But, as we said earlier, you don't have to understand everything to believe in something. And I've always said, I don't want a God that I completely understand. I want him to be God. So let's get back to our blind guy, all right? Blind all his life. And then he has an encounter with Jesus. Jesus, spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. Now that's kind of gross, right? In our society, spitting is, looked down upon. Athletes are fined for doing stuff like that. Let me put it this way to you. Those of you who have kids, those of us have grandkids, if one of them came home from school and said, the teacher spit on me, there's lawsuits coming, right? It's pretty big deal. But this was what, I don't know if the blind man accepted it or protested. He couldn't see it. Maybe Jesus told him, didn't matter, right? He made this mud, spread it on his eyes. He said, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went. I guess if you're blind, you don't have much to lose, right? So the man went and washed and just casually mentions came back seeing. Not a little deal, big deal, right? Now, where do you think he goes first? If you were blind all your life and you got to see, where would you go first? Goes tell his parents, right? Mom, Dad, you won't believe this. I can see. He didn't go to Jesus. Eventually he encounters Jesus again. So he's in his community, small community, people know each other. So we get this interesting commentary from the folks in town. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar, see him every day, we walk by as he's begging, ask, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? He looks like him, but he can see now, right? And so some of them said, no, it just looks like him, because that guy can't see. This guy can see, so it can't be him. It's got to be a look-like, right? So the guy speaks up. You're talking about me? Yes, I'm the guy. I'm the same guy. So then the logical question is, what's happened to you? They ask, who healed you? What happened? All right? So what's the man going to tell him? Exactly what happened, right? He said, I don't know. I can't explain it, right? I don't understand it. Next verse. Next verse, please. There we go. I don't know. He didn't understand. So then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. Well, why is this happening? The Pharisees are the religious leaders. Because it was on the Sabbath. Why is that an issue? Why is that a problem? Because it was considered, healing is considered work. Do we work on the Sabbath? No, we don't. So Jesus had made the mud and healed him. That was a no-no on the Sabbath. So, young man's in front of the Pharisees. They're going to ask him some questions. So they asked the man about it. Okay. So he told them, here's what happened. He, of course we know is Jesus, put the mud over my eyes. Like he said, I went and washed, and I could see. So, again, there are some things I don't understand, we don't understand, right? He didn't understand. But there are some things that are undeniable. What was undeniable? He could see. He couldn't explain it, but he could see. So some of the Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God because he sinned by working on the Sabbath, right? But others said, well, wait a minute. How could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So we have this tension, this dilemma. So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Now I see this in myself and folks. I call it, we put God in a box, or God box. We all have this image of God, right? And so that's the God that's in our box. The problem is when something happens that's outside our box. In my personal experience, every time I try and put God in a box, he just laughs and says, you can't put me in a box. And something happens that won't fit into my box. And that's exactly what's happening here, right? And we do this. Something happens. Something is not under your religious tradition. Whether it's more Pentecostal or maybe more liturgical. And we say, well, God can't be in that, or God's not in that. How do we know? And then we do these if-then things. God says, if I do this, then God does that. It's like I can manipulate God, right? Because that's the God I have in my box. And so I do this, and then God doesn't do that. Or God does something different. So I put on your outline simply this. The Pharisees didn't understand. That's fine, they didn't understand. So constantly, though, they wouldn't believe. Because they couldn't understand. I'm not going to believe it unless I can understand it. So God, on your outline, God is often doing the most when we understand it the least. Because it's usually in those tough times in life where we learn and where we grow, right? And so, don't know what he's doing. Hindsight, we can look back and say, oh, that's what God was doing. So this is a long story, so I'm going to kind of summarize the next part. Guy's talking to the Pharisees, so they said, what's your opinion? And he said, well, he must be a prophet, and they didn't want to hear that. So they went and talked to his parents and said, is this really your son? Said, yeah. And the parents said basically, yes, he's our son. We don't understand, but now he can see. And they didn't want to get thrown out of the synagogue, so they said, you talk to him. He's old enough to answer for himself. So that's where we'll pick up the text. So, for the second time, they called a man who had been blind and told him, God should get the glory for this, not this Jesus guy. Because we know this Jesus is a sinner, and he shouldn't get the glory. So, here's their dilemma, and they're kind of pushing this dilemma on this blind man. So the blind man said, okay, enough of this discussion, and here's what he says. I don't know about this Jesus guy. I don't know whether he's a sinner or a prophet or whoever he is. But I know something. And here's what I know. I was blind, now I see. You can argue about the man that did it and how he did it. Reality is, I was blind, now I see. Can't argue with that. That's the facts. And that's why it's so important for you and I to have a story. Those of us who are Jesus followers. If you're not, we're glad you're joining us. But if you're a Jesus follower, you have a Jesus story, right? A transformation story. And why that's so important, you can argue with this story out of the Bible because it's in the Bible. Maybe somebody made it up. But nobody can argue with your story. Right? We showed Jacob's last week. Not in here again? And I don't know if you went and talked to Jacob later, but you did. Hopefully you didn't argue and say, no, that didn't happen to you. We showed Chris's a few weeks before that. So, when you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe, you can say, okay, it's fine, you don't believe, but I believe because this happened to me. My life was changed, right? I'm different because of Jesus. Nobody can argue with that. So again, what are some things that are undeniable? The sun's going to come up tomorrow morning? Well, we might not be able to see it. It might be raining. But what are some things that are undeniable? The complexity of the universe. The complexity of our bodies. So you have one of two options, right? This all just happened by accident, or God did it. Only two options I can see. We just celebrated Easter, the resurrection. Resurrection is one of the best documented ancient historical events there is. And one of the proofs that we have that it must have been real was most of the disciples were martyred. They were persecuted and killed because they believed in Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. Now let me ask you, how many of you are going to die for something that wasn't real? The fact that 1 billion people in the world still believe this today, 2,000 years later. That's undeniable. So again, you don't have to understand everything. In fact, nobody understands everything. To believe in something. Now, one of the tendencies we have is to try and explain God. But let me just say, put your mind at ease. You don't have to try and explain God. God can explain himself. And that's why we have this book, for example. All right, so this is a situation. What happens next? Well, Jesus kind of looks for this guy. And so Jesus heard what had happened. So he was kind of being persecuted by the religious leaders. So Jesus kind of, I think, wants to go and kind of give him some support. He found the man and asked, "Do you believe?" In this case, in the Son of Man. Do you believe? The man says, "Who is he? I want to believe in him. Just tell me who he is." And Jesus says, "You've seen him. He is who's speaking to you." And his response is what? "This guy just changed my life forever. I was blind, now I can see." He says, "Yes, Lord, I believe. I don't know a lot, but I know enough to believe." And he worshiped Jesus. Now he could see him. Again, can you see Jesus in your situations, your life right now? The question is, can you see enough? Can you see enough to believe him? Can you see enough to trust him? Notice what he says next. "I entered the world," Jesus speaking, "to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind." So, those of you who are Jesus followers, everyone's blind spiritually initially. So you came to a place where one day you could see. You believed enough to see. Some people that refuse to see are blinded. And I always tell people, when you're talking with somebody who doesn't believe, sometimes it's easy to get frustrated with them or not even want to talk to them. If you really thought that person was blind, how would you treat them? Graciously, right? And Jesus tells us to do that. One other quick story and we'll finish up. Jesus was resurrected. He was showing up at different times to different groups of people. He showed up to disciples, except for Thomas wasn't there. We don't know why. Thomas wasn't there. So he met with probably the other 10, right? And other people. So when Thomas shows up, what do the disciples say? Jesus was just here. You just missed him. He really is alive. And what is Thomas's response? "Well, I didn't see it, so I don't believe it." So our gracious God, Jesus in this case, says, "Okay, Thomas, you need something else?" So they're meeting together another time, and Jesus shows up when Thomas is there, right? Thomas, you said you want to see the nail prints. Here it is. So Thomas believed, right? So what was Jesus' response to Thomas? And then we'll be finished. You believe because you've seen me, right? You saw the nail print. You believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Which is basically the church for the last 2,000 years, right? None of us have seen Jesus, but we believed, and we're blessed for that. So, next step. You don't have to understand everything to believe in something. And most specifically, to believe in Jesus, right? In fact, Jesus says to come as you are. You don't have to fix yourself. You don't have to understand a whole lot of stuff. You just got to trust me. Just let me help you. Lots of things are unexplainable, right? But this week, focus holding on to things that are undeniable. You understand enough to believe. The young man worshiped God when he experienced Jesus. We were reading through the Psalms, and a lot of Psalms are about praise, and we sang a song about praise. And so we'll read that as our verse of the week. Psalm 100. Shout with joy to the Lord. All the earth, worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him singing with joy. And we'll have the opportunity to sing one more time before we're dismissed. Let me pray with you. Father God, thank you. I thank you for this amazing story, supernatural story, where Jesus brought sight to a literally blind man. And yet the religious leaders, the Pharisees, who supposed to know you, missed it. So God, you know these folks. You know where they are in their belief or unbelief. And I would pray today for those who do not believe that they believe enough to take that step, to trust you, and let you transform their lives. Most of us being Jesus followers, we've experienced this. It's awesome. It's God's grace to us, right? We all have challenges and we all struggle. Things we want to believe that maybe we're having a hard time believing. And we pray that prayer. We believe. God, help our unbelief. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.